For 95% of the time humans have existed, there were no bars, no cells, no guards. There wasn't a single prison on Earth, and a murderer still rarely lasted more than a few weeks. No trial dragged on for years, no sentence lasted decades. So how did people with no jails, no police, and no judges keep their most dangerous members in check? For most of human history, people lived in bands of 20 to 50. Everyone knew everyone's face, everyone's voice, everyone's temper. There was no anonymity to hide behind, no separate city to disappear into unnoticed. If you did something wrong, the only witnesses you'd ever have to face again were the same people you'd be sharing a fire with tomorrow night. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying societies still living this way. The Juhohansi of the Kalahari, the Mbuti of the Congo, foraging bands across 5 continents, and found something remarkably consistent among them. They were fiercely, deliberately egalitarian, and they defended that equality with a set of escalating social tools that had nothing to do with cages. Boehm called it a reverse dominance hierarchy. Instead of one strong person controlling the group controlled anyone who tried to become that person. And it did so on purpose, collectively, and constantly. This wasn't lawlessness. It was law with no separate building to house it in, no uniformed enforcers, no delay between offense and response. The rules lived inside the relationships themselves, and the system almost never started with violence. It started with talk. Long before any formal punishment was handed down, a person's behavior was already on trial in a courtroom that never closed. Conversation. Boehm's research describes gossip as the primary mechanism of social control inside these bands. A constant, low-level surveillance network where hoarding meat, bullying someone weaker, or acting too full of yourself got discussed behind your back long before it was ever raised to your face. In a band of 40 people, a bad reputation could spread by sundown. And in a world with no strangers and nowhere else to go, reputation wasn't just an opinion about you. It functioned as currency, and currency you couldn't afford to lose. Miss too many hunts, take too large a share, or push people around once too often, and the conversation about you would start well before anyone confronted you directly. By the time an elder or a respected hunter finally raised the issue face to face, the entire band had usually already made up its mind. If gossip didn't fix the behavior, the group escalated openly. Ridicule came next. Mockery, teasing, deliberately deflating anyone acting too proud or too aggressive. Even the best hunters in these societies were expected to downplay their own kills, because confidence that tipped into arrogance was treated as an early warning sign of someone who might try to dominate the group later. Among the Arctic Inuit of the Canadian Arctic, unresolved tension between 2 men could even be settled through something close to a public rap battle, a song duel, where rivals traded insults in front of the whole camp, and the crowd's laughter decided who'd lost face. Nobody died. Nobody went to trial. The dispute simply ended in public humiliation for the loser, witnessed by everyone who mattered. If ridicule failed, the next step was colder: shunning. A person could be frozen out of conversation, left out of the hunt, treated as though they simply weren't there. For a species that survived almost entirely through cooperation and shared food, social invisibility wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a genuine threat to survival, delivered without anyone laying a hand on you. When shunning still wasn't enough, many societies had one option left, short of killing someone outright: send them away for good. Historical accounts of tribal justice across North America describe banishment as one of the harshest penalties available, formally casting a person out of the only community that knew how to keep them alive in that particular landscape. Without a group to share food, defend territory against rivals, or pass down the specific survival knowledge of that place, exile in the deep past was, for many people, a slow death sentence that required no executioner at all. Among the Netsilik, there's a related pattern. A person responsible for a killing would often simply flee to distant territory for years, gambling that time and distance would cool the anger of the victim's relatives before he dared show his face again. The group didn't have to hunt you down. It just had to stop being your group. And when someone was violent enough, repeatedly enough, that the entire band was genuinely endangered, some groups did resort to killing. But it looked almost nothing like what we picture when we hear the word execution. Boehm's research documents cases where a persistently dangerous individual was killed not by one furious avenger, but by collective decision, the band quietly discussing the problem amongst themselves over time, arriving at agreement together and acting as a single unit specifically so that no one person carried the blame or invited a revenge killing in return. In one account from the Baruya people of Papua New Guinea, a man who had repeatedly stolen from his neighbors and assaulted their wives was ultimately killed by his own community after warnings failed to change his behavior. It wasn't a mob acting on rage. It was closer to a jury reaching a verdict, slow, deliberate, and collective by design. The deliberateness mattered. In a band with no separate justice system, a killing carried out by one furious individual could easily spiral into a blood feud that split the group for a generation. A killing carried out by everyone, together, after open discussion, ended the problem instead of starting a new one, because there was no single person left for the dead man's relatives to take revenge against. Not every tradition ended in exile or execution, even for homicide. Among several Native American nations, a killing could instead be resolved through restitution rather than retribution, the offender's family negotiating a payment to the victim's kin, or the offender taking on responsibilities the deceased once held within that family. Historical accounts describe people who had caused serious harm going on to become some of the most devoted, reliable members of the very family they had wronged, precisely because reintegration, not permanent punishment, was the actual goal of the process. The underlying question was never simply, how do we make this person suffer? It was, how do we get this group functioning again, together? In a band that couldn't afford to lose a hunter, a mother, or a pair of hands during a hard winter, permanently discarding a member of the community was sometimes a luxury nobody could afford. Restitution kept the group's numbers intact while still making the cost of violence unmistakably clear to everyone watching. None of this required a police force, a courthouse, or a single professional whose entire job was administering punishment. It worked because everyone in the band had a direct stake in the outcome, and everyone could watch the process unfold with their own eyes. There was no appeal to a higher authority because there was no distance between the people judging and the people affected by the judgment. The band's survival depended on solving problems quickly and getting back to the daily work of staying alive, which meant justice couldn't afford to be slow, hidden, or abstract. It had to be immediate, social, and visible, or it didn't work at all. We didn't invent the impulse to punish, and we didn't invent the impulse to forgive. Both were already fully operational in bands of humans tens of thousands of years before the first written law was ever carved into stone. What we built in the meantime are the walls, the distance between the person who judges and the person being judged, years instead of days, institutions instead of a shared fire everyone sat around. Whether that distance made justice better or simply made it easier to look away from is a question every generation since has had to keep answering for itself. For the vast majority of our species' time on this planet, there was no away to send someone to. There was only the fire, the faces around it, and whatever the group decided to do about the person sitting closest to the edge of the light.